Okay, this is Barbara Elistad with Mesquite Citizen Journal, and we're here today with Karen Beausoleil, who is the candidate for the Mesquite Justice of the Peace position in the upcoming general election. And you only have about, what, 4 or 5 weeks now, and pretty soon we're...
About 6, almost.
Yeah.
6,
Okay.
5.5.
Hey, I'm losing track of time with all of this, so anyway. So we're going to talk today, kind of get some of your ideas and opinions and views on the responsibilities of the position and how you would look at some of the situations you might face if you're elected as a JP.
Okay.
Okay? I know you've probably explained this 100 times. One more. Tell us what you see are the responsibilities and duties of the position of the Justice of the Peace.
The Justice of the Peace Court is one of 2 courts in Mesquite. This is the county court, and it handles both civil and criminal type of cases. They're small type things. Arraignments are done in this court for gross misdemeanors and for felonies, but they're not tried here, they're not heard here.
Okay.
So the civil matters are issues where people have conflicts with one another over something that happened, and that can be settled monetarily, in other words, with money damages.
Okay.
If somebody wanted an injunction or something, it cannot be issued out of this court. And there are some state statutes that control things like, for example, tenant-landlord. Those kinds of things are heard in this court as well, because they're controlled by state statute, and they're civil matters. And then on the criminal side, there's the misdemeanors involving violations of state law rather than city ordinances. Mm-hmm. So those are the kinds of things that come before the Justice Court.
Okay. Explain the difference between the municipal judge and the Justice of the Peace position. There's some separation there. Tell us what that is.
Well, first of all, the Justice of the Peace position is an elected position, and that's where you, the voters, have a say. Mm-hmm. Indirectly, you kind of have a say with the municipal court because you elect the city council, but it's indirect, and therefore you don't directly have a say in that. Mm-hmm. It's an appointed position, and it's appointed by city council. The municipal court judge really handles only the criminal side of things. They're not big criminal things, they're city ordinances that have been violated. Mm-hmm. So it's only like traffic citations within the city, things that the council has felt compelled to have ordinances that control them, and violations involve some kind of, usually they're vandalism, for example, some kind of penalty. Okay. So it's the city versus the individual who has allegedly violated some kind of ordinance, and therefore the judge is deciding those kinds of issues. There aren't civil aspects of the judgeship.
You've been a pretty outspoken opponent of having the same person fill both positions, the municipal judge and the Justice of the Peace.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about why you don't like that setup.
Well, for one thing, it doesn't make those 2 courts independent, and really they should be independent. There shouldn't be a commingling of records or information sharing across those 2 courts. They're separate. They deal with separate kinds of things. And one person in charge of both courts makes it very difficult for non-bias coming into the picture, because that one judge sees people on both sides of things. It also creates a situation where there's double dipping, so one person is getting essentially two salaries. The relationship with the city hall, with the police, is a little different in the municipal court than it would be in the justice court, because typically it is the police who are issuing citations for people who have violated this. So the police and the municipal court judge tend to have a closer relationship, and I think that again adds bias and conflicts of interest. So I think it's really important to keep those two separate. And the way you do that is you have separate judges. The other thing that's an advantage is you've got somebody who's kind of looking over your shoulder, that can kind of monitor to say, hey, I don't think that was the way you ought to go on that, and maybe you ought to rethink the way you're approaching that particular thing. I think that's always a growth potential advantage, to have two qualified people who are kind of watching each other's back, so to speak. So I really think it's important to keep those two positions separate.
Okay. As Justice of the Peace, if you're elected, you'd be dealing a lot with other government entities and law organizations in Vegas.
Yes.
With the district attorney, the public defender's office, those kinds of things. How do you see that relationship? How do you see yourself fulfilling that relationship with those and working with those other agencies?
I would see no problem, no conflicts there, because again, they're an arm's length kind of transaction. So working with them to me would seem just a logical extension of the job that's entailed in the city here. As you already know, I also have a very strong and lengthy background in psychology. So dealing with other people is just part of what I've always done. Okay. And trying to analyze how best to approach whatever particular problem is through those entities, I would see no problem.
Okay. Give us a little bit, since you kind of opened the door there with your background in psychology, give us a little bit of your philosophy on dealing with domestic violence cases.
Well, as a school psychologist, I worked with families a lot, and I also worked with kids a lot. And there are all kinds of dynamics going on in a home situation where one person is claiming to be abused by another, or there's a fight that ensues and they're both hauled in, or what have you. But often, I think it's important to understand what those dynamics are. I have heard complaints from people who've appeared in the court on abuse charges where drugs were involved, and the judge didn't feel it imperative to check out whether that was an issue. If you've got somebody high on methamphetamine, of course, then that person is a danger to her or himself, as well as perhaps any other individuals involved. So sometimes it's kind of imperative that one person in that relationship has to kind of physically control the other if it endangers children or neighbors or the person themselves. So I couldn't imagine having somebody claiming a drug situation with one party without having that investigated before making decisions about what to do.
Well, you know, it seems like I see the police blotter every week, and it seems like, you know, we have at least one or two cases almost every week with domestic violence. Do you think it's more prevalent, or do you think it's kind of the norm in the community of Mesquite itself?
I think it's kind of the norm nationwide.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of frustration in the changing roles of men and women in terms of being brought up in a family that is very male dominated, with the expectation that the man makes the decision and the woman is supposed to just do what she's told. And most women see that that's not the role they want anymore. And it may even involve the children. Children don't really see any modeling for second-class citizenry if they at least get outside the family. They may within the family if mom's still willing to be told what to do, but they don't see it universally. So a lot of individuals get very frustrated with, hey, wait a minute, this isn't the way it's supposed to work. You're supposed to toe the line. I'm the guy who wears the pants in the house.
Yeah.
And if you're not doing what I expect you to do, I react with the only thing I seem to know how to do, and that's usually with violence. And of course, violence begets violence. When children are raised in the environment that, you know, if you step out of line, you get hit, it teaches them to hit. So it's a situation that continues generation after generation until somehow we intervene and say, there's a better way to deal with these problems than using violence. And part of it is bringing to the forefront that it is a problem, it does exist, and that there is recourse for people who are caught in that situation. Often it involves counseling, sometimes it involves both partners, sometimes family as well. But I don't think it's any more prevalent, I don't think it's really less prevalent either, but it's more acknowledged.
Okay.
So it seems to be that there's more. I think it was behind closed doors a lot more in the past.
Talk about restraining orders and your philosophy about issuing restraining orders in these kinds of cases, you know, domestic violence and other harassment and violence cases.
Well, I've heard some people say that they were told by a judge that there's no point in having a restraining order because it doesn't do any good. And I think that that's the wrong approach. I think that restraining orders send a message, and that is, there's a problem here, and one party to this situation feels that they are endangered. Now, that isn't always true. A restraining order is an exceptional sort of situation in that it's issued without the other party being there. And therefore, without recourse to the court, it violates due process. So, in terms of issuing a restraining order, there must be the availability within a short period of time, and typically it's within 10 days, that the other party, so they're temporary, the other party has the right to be heard too. And sometimes it's a matter that it was unfounded, and therefore that needs to be lifted. So yes, for safety's sake, they're good.
Okay.
And even though it may not prevent more abuse, it's a warning sign, and it also needs to go to our enforcement officers to say, there's a restraining order in place, and that means you need to kind of monitor the situation and react quickly.
Okay. All right. Juveniles. Some of your philosophy about dealing with juveniles, some recourses that, you know, you could possibly take as a justice of the peace. I understand you probably wouldn't deal with that many juvenile cases as a justice of the peace.
Probably not. Those typically would go down into the courts in the family courts in Las Vegas.
Okay.
However, there are some programs, well, a program in various places within Las Vegas that the League of Women Voters got behind and started. And that's a diversion program for juveniles. And what happens in that situation, and actually we tried to get it off the ground here, and it kind of hit a roadblock in that the person who decided that the volunteers had to be background checked extensively
Okay.
Created in the volunteers a refusal to do that, because they were coming forward to say, I would sit in on this mediation process and I would have no outside contact with the kids or the family at all outside of this. So why do I need this thorough background check that I think is very intrusive? And so it fell apart. I would like to see if we've got a group that's willing to spearhead that again, that go ahead and get into place. And how it works in Las Vegas, where it's been enacted, is that there are people in the community who volunteer to come in to minimum to listen to trying to find the parties involved to try to find a resolution. In other words, a juvenile who is a first-time offender, not one who's got a long history, that's not appropriate for them.
Okay.
But say a first-time offender that the judge feels could benefit from a diversion program without putting that young person into the criminal justice system, would recommend that this person might be amenable to this mediation process. And of course it takes a lot of cooperation on a lot of people's part. The victim of whatever the juvenile did has to be part of it, and the family and or guardians of the juvenile have to be a part of it. And certainly so does the juvenile.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what would happen is that the victim comes into this mediation process and talks about how that juvenile violated some aspect of his rights or her rights. And what it would take to make that individual whole again. And then the juvenile and his family and or guardians would either say, I can or cannot accomplish that.
Okay.
And the mediators are there just to keep them from getting into a full-blown fight or name-calling or what have you. In other words, that it's your turn and you be quiet and we listen here, and now it's your turn and you be quiet and you listen here. They're merely mediators. They're not making judgments. They're not involved other than keeping control of the process. And if the victim and the juvenile and his support group come to a decision that there is something the young person could do with the support of his family, and it can be done over a period of time where there's going to be follow-up to make sure that these things were accomplished in a timely manner to essentially satisfy the victim that the youngster has attempted to make that person whole, then there's a timeline, a contract drawn up, and the youngster tries to adhere to those guidelines. And then a follow-up to come back and say, okay, the time has passed. Have you been successful in doing this? And the victim says, yes, I've been, I've had this thing happen, or at least hear from other people if it was something that was outside the victim's control, like community service, and it didn't effectively direct the victim, and I'm satisfied. And if that did not occur, then the juvenile goes into the justice system.
Okay.
But you know, if we could prevent kids from becoming repeat offenders, keeping them out of the system, give them a chance to start over, I think it's well worth the effort.
Yeah. Okay. Talk about some of your background, and let's start with your law training, your other education, but I also would want to know how much you are involved now in any kind of law activity or justice activity.
Currently, I'm not involved in any except running for this position.
Okay.
I started out as being an educator, teaching, and I love that role. I got involved in a doctoral program in which there was some, it was basically a kind of a family therapy, but it was really an education program for families and students to learn how to do this at University of Arizona in Tucson. And it just made all kinds of sense. So, working on this doctorate degree, I looked at how could I use this and see if it really made a difference. So my doctoral dissertation involved training parents and telling them things they could actually do to help their children become more responsibility oriented, and whether it affected the kids' actual achievement in school. And what I found out is that the more responsibility the kids had at home, they were already the higher achievers. Mm-hmm. But training parents increased that significantly, that achievement. And what the parents were actually being taught how to do was to help children be responsible, where they had legitimate control, and that was at home. So that was just kind of a logical thing as a school psychologist that I did. I often, a teacher would say, this child is not producing well. The first thing I would do is call in the family. Mm-hmm. Say, and the teacher and the child, let's sit down and see what's going on at home. Because I truly believe the keys are at home, and if we give the parents those keys so that they can do something that's going to make a difference, it changes what the child is doing. That changes somewhat when kids become adolescent, because then the peers control and not the home anymore. Mm-hmm. But the parents can still say, this is what I will and will not do, and this is what I will let you do and what I will not let you do, and here's where the limits are. Okay. And live with it.
So how did you get into law?
Well, I worked with so many families, and in the interim, I've always had an interest in law, and I had some family situations that involved lawyers. And I looked at what those lawyers were doing and what they wanted to charge me to do what they were doing, and I said, you know, I could do this better. So I essentially did a lot of the work myself and finally fired the attorneys that were involved. But I said, I need more information. I need the training. So I left school psychology and I went to law school and actually got the training. And then, of course, the logical jumping off place from there was into family law, and that's where I started out, was in basically doing a lot of family law.
Okay.
And my problem became one of insisting where there were children involved not to put the children in the middle as pawns. And they even signed contracts to that effect, and then they violated those contracts. The problem became one of getting out of representing the party who had violated that contract when the case had gone forward so long. Mm-hmm. And the judge was very hesitant to let me out. So I'm going, this is not really working out too well. I did a lot of other things, juvenile matters, competency hearings, filing lawsuits in federal and state courts that were outside of the family arena. And I got really quite involved in civil rights cases. Mm-hmm. Most of those went into the federal courts. Some of them had a long administrative proceeding before that time, which of course I was representing clients, and some of course went all the way to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. So I've been not only admitted to the federal courts, but also into the Court of Appeals to practice. But what I found overall was that I was giving people hope when basically I realized that the law didn't control. What I found was that if you had the power and you had the money, you won. And it didn't matter that the law said otherwise. And I said, I can't stand this anymore. It's tearing me apart. Mm-hmm. And so my husband said, well, let's go retire. Oh,
My
okay.
husband's told me that about 4 times now. It hadn't worked yet.
And that's when we came to Mesquite.
Okay. So how long have you actually practiced, or did you practice law before you retired, or however?
Approximately 7 years.
Okay. And how long have you lived in Mesquite?
11 years.
11
Going
years.
on 12.
Okay. Tell us about your community involvement then.
Well, I found the mosquitoes along the way.
I think everybody has at one time or another.
And that has been great fun and just a wonderful experience in getting to know a lot of other, I call them sisters, they really are sisters. Since I never had any sisters, that's been a really a wonderful experience. I got involved with the League of Women Voters. I had been a member way back in the past in another state, and I just loved the contact with women who were involved in their community and cared about the political process and having informed voters, because that's really the basic thrust of what the League does, is not taking sides per se, but to inform voters of what those sides actually entail, what's involved in both sides of the situation. Sometimes they do take a stand when it involves the community, not people, but the community itself.
Okay.
But most of the time, they're a vehicle for informing.
Okay. Do you live here full-time or part-time?
I live here full-time the last couple of years.
Okay.
I spent 3 weeks in Colorado. My husband's still in Colorado.
Oh, okay.
But just more and more of my life has been here rather than up in the mountains, and it's just it's a pleasant time to go up into the mountains, but then
I just did a couple weeks ago. It was great.
Yeah, but then there's nothing for me to do. Writing my memoirs or
now most people say that about Mesquite, although that's not true either.
Yeah, so most of my life is really centered around being here, so I have been here the last couple of years pretty much year round.
Okay. Okay, anything you want to say
Well,
to wrap it up?
Speaking to the voters,
Okay.
again, it's really important in this situation that you make your voice heard. If you feel having separate courts is an important aspect of keeping those courts honest, you need to vote, because my opponent wants both positions. And I suspect if you vote him in as the Justice of the Peace, the council will probably offer him the other. So if you want separate courts, I'm your person.
Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Karen. We appreciate your time today, and good luck in the election.
Thank you.
It's been a long road since January, I think. So.
Oh yeah, and I ran 6 years ago, so this is the second time around.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. We
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.